Hello, everyone, and welcome. It is a bittersweet session. It's our last session out of 17 webinars of meeting ever since April of 2020 when COVID started. And it has been amazing to have such an interactive webinar, getting great questions from you, our audience, and having such fantastic knowledge in times of need. Today, we're ending with a bang, focusing on psychedelic-assisted therapy. This is, of course, a time of increasing mental health crises, particularly among youth and young adults. And so it is even more exciting that new treatment modalities are on the horizon. It has been incredibly disappointing with traditional antidepressants and other drugs. And so the emergence of psychedelics in the field of mental health, or the reemergence, I should say, has brought so much hope and interest and hype. And so today I'm bringing you 3 leading experts in this area, so you can really hear where's this field at from them, what do you need to know, how do you find a trial if you're interested, and really dive in a bit both to the science of psychedelic therapy as well as access and equity issues. So with that, I'd like to introduce our 3 speakers. First, we are so happy to be joined by Sara Reed, who is the CEO and founder of Mind's iHealth Solutions, a digital mental health treatment company, which includes ketamine therapy. And she has had an important role as a research study therapist in trials of psychedelic therapy at Yale. And she has brought really fresh and new perspectives as a feminist, as someone looking at social equity and racial trauma, and how we're going to address these huge issues in this burgeoning field. Welcome, Sara.
Thank you.
Next, I'd like to introduce Chuck Raison. Chuck, or maybe I should call you Charles, but he's a friend. He is one of the most Renaissance researchers I know of the mind and of psychiatric disease. He deeply understands the mind-body connection. He has pioneered both the psychoneuroendocrine and immune pathways of depression and stress and treatments, as well as forging new pathways in understanding treatments that really build on the hormetic stress response, like hyperthermia. He's conducted some of the first trials showing that thermoregulation is actually a treatment path. And so now he's has a very important role in the psychedelic world. First, I should say he's a professor at the University of Madison, Wisconsin, a distinguished chair for healthy minds. And he's also the director of clinical translational research for USONA Institute. So he'll tell us more about that important role overseeing national research and funding in this area. Welcome, Chuck. And lastly, I'm so happy to bring you Robin Carhart Harris. He is the leading neuroscientist in psychedelic research, and he comes at this with such rigorous methods and multiple methods to really understand the mechanisms, the neural mechanisms, the experience, the biology, and really link these together. I'm so pleased to say he is now at UCSF. So to some good fortune and good work on our colleagues at Neuroscape, he has just started a new division of psychedelic research at Neuroscape, UCSF. Welcome, Robin.
Thank you, Elissa.
So why don't we start with you, Robin? We're going to have each of you just talk to us a bit and give us some background on your perspective of where this field is at, where it's going, what people should know. And keeping in mind our audiences, we have a good mix, including a lot of health professionals. Now, Robin, you have done the hard work of the most rigorous and large-scale clinical trials in this area, and that's probably been the most transformative thing to this field. And so I'd love you to start where you'd like, but end with the big splash there.
Sure. Well, happy to, and I will. That recent publication in the New England Journal of Medicine comparing psilocybin therapy with 6 weeks of a conventional antidepressant drug, escitalopram. perhaps in another order, just starting with the basics, we're talking about psychedelics and psychedelic. The roots of the term come from ancient Greek, psyche for soul, or psyche if you use that term and understand it. And the other component means to make manifest or to reveal. So that's quite an abstract definition, if you can call it a definition. And perhaps a crisper one is to look at the pharmacology of what we call classic psychedelics. And these are compounds like LSD, psilocybin, DMT found in ayahuasca. And they're all direct agonists of a serotonin receptor subtype, the serotonin 2A receptor, heavily expressed in the cortex and particularly hierarchically at the top of the cortex in transmodal association cortex, evolutionarily the most expanded cortex in our species and the cortex that undergoes the most expansion developmentally, if you want. So that's these are the classic psychedelics. They stimulate that serotonin 2A receptor. Then you have kind of quasi psychedelics like MDMA, very powerful compounds in their own right that stimulate the serotonin system more broadly. And there are some indirect effects on the 2A receptor, but also other serotonin and other neuromodulator receptors. And if we are getting excited about psychedelics, one of the reasons perhaps is that they suggest, the evidence suggests that they may have a transdiagnostic potential. They may target a common denominator, if you want, to psychological suffering. And how they may rectify this common space is perhaps through their ability to enhance plasticity, probably cortical plasticity specifically. Plasticity, the most simple dictionary definition you could say, is the ability to change or the ability to be shaped or molded. So if they're promoting that, we talk about psychedelic therapy, and there's a big clue there in the name that we use psychedelics in clinical research as a combination treatment. We don't just give the drug. All of the wealth of the evidence is suggesting, granted it's all involved manipulation of the delivery of the drug in a positive way and a supportive way with psychological preparation. I think across the board, music listening during these sessions and then psychological integration afterwards. So that's not just giving a drug, that's, you know, curating this experience. So psychedelic therapy is a combination treatment. We think it's about harnessing that drug-induced enhancement of cortical plasticity and channeling it in a particular way, in a therapeutic way. And that common denominator, it could be how, you know, young plastic brains and so on become set in pathological ways, and perhaps certain habits of mind and behavior become stamped in and they're unhealthy, whether they're negative cognitive biases in depression or addictions, specific addictions or anxieties or ways of looking at yourself in terms of, say, body disorders, image disorders such as anorexia, body dysmorphic disorder. So if you can enhance plasticity, the ability to change, and then utilize and exploit that opportunity, that window of opportunity, and then channel it in a particular way, that's the essence, I would say, of psychedelic therapy. And if we now begin to start thinking about that recent trial that we did, part of the motivation there in making a conventional drug treatment the active comparator arm was a sense that maybe there, first of all, is a different mechanism of action with psychedelic therapy, specifically psilocybin therapy. We used 2 high-dose treatment sessions in this trial. And we believe, based on observations and interviewing with our patients from a previous trial in treatment-resistant depression, that the psilocybin had a different effect on one's ability to sit with emotion, to release emotion, and to work through personal issues, difficult memories and emotions, process them, have insight about their etiology, how they came about. And this sort of epistemic process, this learning process, and in many ways a relearning process, relearning their relationship with themselves and others and beyond, seem to be catalyzed by the drug in that therapeutic container. And in the TRD trial, in interviews, people were saying that conventional drug treatments work very differently. And of course, there's other literature speaking to this, that as my former mentor, David Nutt, would say of SSRIs, they incubate against stress. They help you get by, but they probably don't, they're not as effective in terms of getting to root causes and that kind of, you know, profound transformation that you can see with psychedelic therapy. So this you know, was borne out in the results of that trial, that if we look particularly at positive affective processing, things like anhedonia scores, the ability to experience pleasure again, work and social functioning. I encourage people to look up that paper, but specifically look at the data and look at the supplementary appendix, where there's some really important data on this kind of thing. Look at the profile of the increase in well-being. We had a highly validated measure of well-being in there, but we also had a measure of flourishing, both marked increases with psilocybin therapy and much more robust increases with the psilocybin than with the SSRI. So do look at those data. Other naturalistic work that we've done has also supported this multifaceted increase in well-being that you see even in healthy volunteers. Sure, there's ceiling effects sometimes, but look up a paper from Kocherova et al. I'm the senior author on that. That's in Frontiers in Psychiatry, about this comprehensive improvements in well-being in a very general population, a few hundred people in this prospective survey approach that we took. And also look up, in fact, that was a paper reporting on the transdiagnostic idea, but it's very relevant. And then Kerry Mann's, M-A-N-S, is that comprehensive well-being paper. So there were limitations to that trial, the New England Journal of Medicine one, the demographics, it was a kind of homogeneous sample. Perhaps we'll talk about that a little bit more as we go on, but that gives you a flavor of some of our research, some of the promise that we're seeing with psilocybin therapy specifically, but not exclusively in the treatment of mental illness.
Thank you so much, Robin. That was an amazing summary of, you know, a huge body of work, and there's so much there in the some of the papers Robin mentioned. We'll post those on our website. It's you know, it's so exciting that change can happen so quickly, that people can feel more of that kind of eudaimonia and positive affect, where we don't get that. We get more of a numbing from the antidepressants. What does just the drug alone do? You know, it kind of prepares for plasticity, but what role, how important is the therapy and quality therapy in this, in shaping healing?
Well, we assume it's essential, and we can speak to that, to evidence supporting that only indirectly, really. So, for example, people's ratings of the quality of the experience they have seem to be predictive of the therapeutic outcomes. Some of the setting factors, if you look at our naturalistic research, having a structured setting seems to be especially useful for people. Having a therapeutic setting as opposed to some kind of, you know, spontaneous, impulsive use of a psychedelic, say at a party. So we assume it's very important. Some of the research I plan at UCSF will try and address this in a more formal, systematic way. And I think that'll be important for the field.
Yes. Thank you so much. We will come back to you when we have our Q&A. Chuck, we would love to hear from you how you got into this, what your role is overseeing research in this area, and your, you know, view of where this field is going, the challenges and the opportunities.
Sure. Well, yeah, thanks, Elissa. So as you know, I mean, you said it, I have this long-term interest in trying to find novel ways to treat depression, especially ways that don't require that a drug sit on the brain's receptors constantly, because we know with all these sorts of agents, they produce largely unwanted secondary changes. And so, I've been long interested in whether there aren't more like targeted, time-limited treatments to produce effects in the brain and body that are then self-sustaining. So, psilocybin's in the body for 6-7 hours, and yet people many times feel better for months afterwards. Well, there's not an ongoing drug pushing on the receptors to explain that. So obviously what it suggests is that these are agents that then set in motion processes that become at least somewhat self-sustaining in the body and brain. And I think actually that this is going to be the optimal future when we can do it of mental health treatments, because it'll avoid the challenges that come with always taking a drug and then the brain-body complex becoming reliant on that drug. Now, sometimes that is the best outcome. It's far better than being devastated by a major mental illness. But again, if we can find ways to build up sort of self-sustaining resilience within the person's own biology, I think that is going to be one of the really exciting ways forward. And of course, this is one of the reasons I got into psychedelics. I had many of the things I've looked at are actually what I might call ancient practices. You mentioned the hyperthermia. Heat's been used for thousands of years around the world as a healing modality, and it turns out it has very rather potent and rapid antidepressant effects. But we're talking about psychedelics today, and so let me give a more general sense. So Robin is, of all people in the world, one of the people I most envy, because he gets to do all this wonderful, fun stuff. My role in this space is largely more pragmatic. So one of the hats I wear is, as you mentioned, as Director of Clinical and Translational Research for USANA Institute, which is a nonprofit medical research organization founded in 2015 with the goal of conducting the type of studies that allow these agents, if the studies are successful, to get FDA approval as treatments, which is a pretty steep hill because these agents, have been illegal for quite a while. It's interesting, these agents do have diagnostic signals. If you look, there were like 1,000 studies done back in the 1960s looking at the potential of these agents for therapeutic uses. And two things that stood out were they seemed to help people with substance abuse, especially alcohol. And they also seemed to help people that were dying deal with fear around death. And so when the field got kicked up again around the beginning of the 21st century, and researchers began to look at things, when they turned to exploring, what kind of indications should we look at if we want to try to get FDA approval? The first several were those. So there were 1,000 in substance abuse, suggesting drinking or stop smoking or stop doing drugs. The other area where people returned to was looking at depression and anxiety in the context of mortality, in this case, cancer. And the field really blew wide open in 2015, 2016, when two studies were published, one from Johns Hopkins, one from NYU, showing that a single treatment with a high dose of psilocybin produced profound reductions in depressive and anxious symptoms. And these reductions in that population lasted for at least 6 months. And in some people now, we know for up to 5 years. Those studies were really instrumental in launching what has become now a very active field of folks that are trying to do studies that meet FDA standards. So in particular, our work at USANA is focused on a single dose, high dose psilocybin for the treatment of major depression. It's interesting, we initially actually wanted to go into the cancer space. And one of the challenges that these agents are going to face is that we're always trying to fit a round peg into a square hole. And the FDA has very, very sort of strict guideline boxes for the kind of things they can give an indication for. They didn't have a way, and I still don't think actually they have a way of giving approval for say, demoralization or fear of death in the context of cancer. You have to go for something like major depression, which has a code. And if you're going to go for major depression in cancer, the FDA wants to see that, what's so special about cancer? We'd want to know whether it works for major depression in general. And so we and others have taken that tack, looking at things like major depressive disorder or treatment-resistant depression. And so now there are active studies underway. We are in the midst of a phase 2 study looking at psilocybin versus placebo for the treatment of regular major depression. So you don't have to be, resistant to drugs to be in the study that we're conducting. Compass Pathways, which is a commercial entity, has finished, we don't know the results yet, we finished a large phase 2 study looking specifically at treatment-resistant depression. The data for that hopefully will be out by the end of the year. There are active studies going on looking at psilocybin in particular for the treatment of substance use disorders. And it's public knowledge now that Matthew Johnson and colleagues at a couple of other universities have received what is really the first large National Institute of Health grant to look at psilocybin treatment for smoking cessation. There's very powerful preliminary data suggesting that a couple of treatments might have these long-term effects in helping people quit smoking. So the field is alive and active, and I hope in our question and answer we'll be able to hit upon what are some of the challenges of trying to take this treatment, which, as Robin said, has thus far been looked at as a marriage of pharmacology with psychotherapy. How do you take that and put it into this very, fairly rigid FDA mandated type buzzsaw, meat grinder, I call it what you want, but the way that we have to run studies of antidepressant agents, there's a lot of interesting tension there. The other thing we might talk about is that there's going to be some really interesting tension around how these agents are commercialized. So when we started, and when USONA started, there was a couple of nonprofits. This was looked at as a sort of as mercy work. These were seen as orphan drugs that had been around for a long time that would be difficult to get approval for because of the stigma. I don't think any of us in the field at that time foresaw that now, 5 or 6 years later, at last count, there's at least 100 commercial entities in this space working on all sorts of agents with all sorts of interests. So there are commercial entities that are very interested in combining these agents with psychotherapy, like MAPS, the Multidisciplinary Association of Psychedelic Studies. It's been working on MDMA for PTSD, clearly sees these agents as ways to augment and optimize psychotherapy. There are other entities in this field that are actively trying to figure out how to get rid of the psychotherapy. And then there are entities in this field that are very committed to trying to find agents that they can build off of psychedelics that are not psychedelics. So there's one of the great fantasies, I think, of the pharmacologic world is that we can find agents that will have all the antidepressant, all the anti-substance abuse benefits of psychedelics, but they won't produce a psychedelic experience. So these are really, really important questions. So hopefully that gives a little bit of an overview.
Yeah, that's a wonderful picture of this landscape, and what we can, see, and we can read about it in the New York Times, is that this is an explosion of research. You probably can't take enough investment money in this. I mean, everyone wants to invest.
Hundreds of millions, hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars, yes.
And so is there, clearly the growth is going to be helpful, but there's always these downsides. And I know you worry, Chuck, about where this is going. And, what would you, do you want to just give us a picture of, your in 5 years, where we could be if things go really well, and vice versa?
Yeah. Well, so if things go really well in 5 years, there will be an FDA approval for at least a couple of these agents administered responsibly, with ways of getting them out into diverse and underserved populations, as well as the largely white upper middle class or upper class folks that have sort of been connected with these agents. Now, one of the things I worry about in 5 years is that there's going to be a backlash against these agents, and the backlash is going to come from the fact that we've over-idealized them. The hype for these agents now as these salvational elements worries me more than anything else. I've watched fads come and go in my lifetime in the US especially. And, as a culture, we get obsessed with, we think, oh, this is going to be the answer. And then, it doesn't save us from our misery entirely. And then people sour on it. They go looking for something else. So I worry about the hype right now that this field is experiencing, because I do believe these agents are going to be hugely useful. I think they're going to be challenging. I don't think they're going to be simple pharmacologic cures, but I think they're going to be valuable. But they're not going to solve the world's problems, I don't personally think. And I worry that people are expecting that of them.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Thank you. We will come back to that. Okay. Welcome, Sara. I just can't wait to hear you talk. You're one of the few voices in this very busy field that's actually pointing out the social inequities and the potential that psychedelics can have for helping with, these great health disparities we have in mental health for people who have been targeted. I love, instead of saying vulnerable groups or BIPOC, I love the new way of just pointing out people who have been disadvantaged socially, structurally. And I think one of the themes that we have addressed in our webinar, particularly early on, is we're just starting to understand, and I mean white people, the intergenerational trauma and the structural racism in every moment and how that affects Black people. And so I think thinking about racial trauma, racial triggering is already such an important new area. And now you're taking this to psychedelic therapy. And what have you seen? And in your experience and your view of the field, how much are diverse samples involved? And we just would love to hear about your personal experience as well.
Yes, yes. Thank you so much, Elissa, for that kind introduction, and shout outs to all the listeners who are live on the call today, as well as the future listeners who will be watching the playback. I am very honored to be here and to be able to share part of my story with you all today. So with that said, I'd like to spend my time talking about my experience both as a therapist and as a participant in this work. And although a newbie in the field, there are some really important findings that I'd like to share. So I'll start with my work as a therapist. So my work goes back to really maybe the end of 2016, where MAPS, or the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, approached my former mentor, former boss, Dr. Monica Williams, about MDMA therapy for PTSD. And MAP specifically contacted Dr. Williams to help them diversify their participant pool, because their participant pool was overwhelmingly white in the MDMA therapy for PTSD clinical trials. And when I say diversify the participant pool, I'm specifically talking about racially diversify the pool. So our site completed or started the MAPS therapist training and became a MAPS sponsored site for the phase 2 clinical trials at UConn Health Center. And our site was focused on recruiting folks of color and providing them with a culturally informed therapeutic experience. And it wasn't until that we really got in the research work that we became aware of a few limitations in the protocol as it was. So particularly with the recruitment strategies, we had to rework the recruitment strategies to make them more relevant and sensitive to the populations that we were trying to serve. And of course, this is with the approval from IRBs, the approval from MAPS, and we also made adjustments to the informed consent form just to make it, again, relevant and sensitive to the needs of BIPOC communities. And for folks who want to learn more about specifically the things that we did to make the research more culturally informed, I will share a link to one of our papers at the end of my segment. So, okay, we've got culturally informed research design as one limitation, and we've also got a limitation, in my perspective, of culturally responsible training or culturally responsible care as it relates to therapist training. So I want to first define what I mean by culturally responsible care. And so for me, culturally responsible care is a practice. It's an attunement to the ways social factors like race, gender, ability, income, education. It's how all of these social factors impact the way symptoms present as well as the outcomes that you have in treatment. For example, research shows that BIPOC communities appear more likely to express psychological distress through bodily symptoms for two reasons. One, there is a higher level of stigma associated with mental illness, so discussing physical symptoms is more socially acceptable. And two, there's less of a distinction between mind and body among these groups. So how does that translate into practice? Well, one way that it can translate into practice is through screening, through the screening and assessment period. Therapists, researchers can be more attuned to the variety of ways symptoms can present in these populations. Another piece that I want to mention about culturally responsible care is that culturally responsible care isn't limited to or through a racialized lens. It can also be included, especially in psychedelic therapy, things like a person's experience with psychedelic medicines prior to coming into psychedelic therapy. So for example, there are some folks who learn about the treatment, are interested in the treatment, and haven't had psychedelics before, haven't experienced psychedelics before. So to me, part of culturally responsible care is attuning to that nuance of, okay, how does the preparatory period look different for someone who hasn't had any experiences with psychedelics versus someone who maybe identifies as a psychonaut and has had a lot of experiences with psychedelics? Another component of culturally responsible care is the element of spirit or spirit-based work. So what I mean by this is, let's say you've got a participant in a clinical trial who is having a very spiritual experience in one of their dosing sessions. And let's say you've got a therapist who's either an atheist or who doesn't prescribe or subscribe to that particular spiritual practice. Well, what does culturally responsible care look like in that particular setting? Because the reality is that if therapists aren't culturally attuned or just aren't attuned to these nuances in treatment, they can harm folks unintentionally, and it can lead to really negative clinical outcomes like unnecessary suicidality. Okay, so moving on to my experience as a participant. So a few years ago, I had the opportunity to enroll in a clinical trial or to take MDMA in a one-time clinical setting as part of the MAPS therapist training. And it was important for me to enroll in that clinical trial because as a Black woman, as a therapist, who was going to be treating folks from racialized communities, I wanted to experience firsthand what it was like to just get a snippet of this drug-assisted treatment as a participant. So in this particular protocol, I had to go through a screening period, a preparatory period. I had dosing sessions, 2 dosing sessions. One was with the active MDMA, one was with placebo, and I also had integration sessions as well. And in the interest of time, I'm only going to talk about the session that I had with the active session with MDMA therapy. And to help illustrate the type of experience or the type of profound experience I had, I wanted to share a little bit of a story that I wrote that really kind of describes my experience of what it was like going through that dosing session. Also, maybe I want to give a quick trigger warning just in case folks, or just to keep folks or make folks aware. So here we go. I feel like I'm dying, but it's okay, I say with a smile on my face. As I lie on the couch with 2 therapists by my side, I lift up my eye shades, constantly checking the clock trying to follow my ascent. That is, trying to figure out the moment when the ordinary becomes the non-ordinary. And I was able to at first, but then there was a moment where time sped up and it felt like my mind, body, and spirit were merging with the medicine. And I'm observing the transformation for a bit, you know, a little disconnected from the experience. But soon enough, the drug sneaks past my mind's defenses, past my reflexive tendency towards control and precision, and catapults me to a place of dissolution, an undoing of false narratives I had picked up and internalized about myself, a release of the criticism that weighed me down and distorted my understanding of myself, an unmasking that was necessary for the journey. And I let the music and medicine carry me away. And shortly thereafter, my deceased grandmother appears, imparting her wisdom not only for me, but for my mother. We shared a beautiful yet brief moment. Tears of love filled my face and joy filled my heart. She carried me to a place I knew existed but never seen, a place that felt so familiar but so distant. I had traveled to the essence of the universe, into a space of divinity. And I finally had a place where I belonged. And for the first time in my adult life, I felt free. Me, a young Black woman, free. No longer bound by the constraints of my political realities, like my race or my gender. I was part of this enormous whole, a place that had no beginning or end, where there was no separation from love. A place I always knew existed but felt so distant from. I call that place home. Now, with the interest of time, I can't share the totality of what my experience was like, but I'll share a link at the end of my talk again to a paper that I wrote with some incredible colleagues, shout outs to Jamila George and Dr. Mark Williams, about our experiences as 3 Black women and therapists who engaged in this MT1 therapeutic experience. But to maybe kind of close the story to that experience, so in the beginning, I was really kind of feeling the sense of liberation, and really feeling the sense of connectedness. But after some time had passed, my body kind of really began to slow down. And I had to really grapple with things like racialized trauma in a way that I had never grappled with before in my life, because that dissolution I experienced also dissolved the defenses that I knew, or the defenses that I had that helped me navigate the only world that I knew, that really kept me from really experiencing that pain of racialized trauma. So although the experience was really opening and liberating in the beginning, I was met with some racialized trauma that really had to be attended to. Now, I'll end my segment by talking about my visions of the future of psychedelic therapy. And so when I envision the future of psychedelic therapy or psychedelic medicine, I think of real community building between both personal experts and professional experts. Because the reality is that the field of psychedelic therapy would not exist without the wisdom and practices from Black and Indigenous communities. So how can we all work together to do the healing work? And as psychedelic therapy goes mainstream, more people are becoming curious about the potential of this medicine work, and they're trying it out on their own. So you've got documentaries coming out, you've got psychedelic therapy being mentioned in sitcoms and other forms of media. And folks are curious. They're already, or at least I'll share a quick example of, there was someone who was interested in ketamine therapy treatment, and I shared what the treatment would be like, as well as the process that they would go through in treatment, as well as the cost. And this person was like, yeah, so I can't afford this type of treatment. What do I do? And I think that's the reality of where we are in this field, is that as psychedelics continue to go mainstream, how are we making psychedelic therapies safe for folks who want to engage in this healing work? Because although, of course, there might be some people who want the treatment but can't afford the treatment, there are also going to be some people who want to engage in the healing work, but they don't want to do it in a medicalized context. So to me, as a field, as a community, I think it's important to really build a multi-sector alliance with folks in drug policy, with folks in harm reduction, with researchers in the field, to really kind of come together to make this type of treatment as safe as possible for those who want to engage. And with that, I will pause here and thank you all for listening, and I look forward to the Q&A section.
Thank you, Sara. Thank you so much. And especially for sharing your personal experience, something that data can never share, but that narrative, and you're so beautifully describing that feeling of home and liberation is, is incredible. It's a small window in for people. And, one of the most amazing things about this field is that it is experiential. And it's so hard with words to describe the transformation people are having. So we'll have a scale, mystical experiences. And yes, that's an important scale. But the narrative of seeing, what true comfort feels like, and then coming back to all of the, racialized identities. And it's I think, there's so much we can learn from this type of therapy. And so my question for you is, healing racialized trauma is already such a difficult field. At UCSF, we don't have enough providers of color for all of the people who would prefer a provider from the same race or ethnic background. And I'm just wondering, is that, what are your recommendations for how to provide culturally sensitive care? And is it, does it need to be from someone of the same race or ethnicity?
Yeah, so when I think about treating racial trauma with psychedelics, I think about, and to do it in safe ways, I think about the preparatory period and how instrumental the preparatory period is in really creating that container of safety where someone can feel safe enough to go to the depths of their trauma. Because one thing that I've learned and continuing to learn in this field is that the therapists that you have absolutely play a critical role in how deep you can go in your experience, or the territory that you explore in your experience. So to me, to really talk about culturally responsible care, I could spend a whole day, maybe even a whole week, to talk about what it really means to provide that type of care. But I think what I'll mention now is that it's important for therapists to be educated and continue that education process, because especially with COVID, the hypervisibility of Black murders like Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, there's been a lot of folks that are like, oh my gosh, like, what can I do? I need to educate, I need to inform myself. And that is a great start. And my hope is that folks don't just stop, that learning just because, we're not in that same year anymore, that it's really a practice. Culturally responsible care, culturally informed care is a practice. It's not something that you can just attend a webinar and like, here are 10 things to be, culturally.
Done.
Exactly.
Let me bring back Chuck and Robin. And so we can have some discussion. That was absolutely beautiful. And there's comments for you in the chat, Sara, of people's appreciation. So, and we have a lot of comments. And so before I jump into any specific question, I just want to give you guys a chance to respond to each other.
Just make a comment that, it's interesting, Sara, the need to get more diversity into these populations is really intense. FDA has signaled that they may make this a criteria upon which they'll judge the acceptance, the approval of these agents or not. That just having, study populations that are 90%, white, non-Hispanic is going to be, at the end of the day, a very pragmatic issue for these agents getting approved for use. So it even down into the very, basic economics of it, this is just a huge, and maybe this is a place where psychedelics can play another role for the good, is to really, sort of highlight these challenges and equities in ways that they have to be dealt with for things to move forward. And so I think for many of us, I think it's become a central issue in the field.
Yeah, I definitely appreciated what you had shared, Robin, about the relearning process that happens post-treatment experience. And I was reminded of a participant who had talked about, like, yes, like I've, healed from my trauma and this is all great, but like, who am I now that I experienced life throughout this trauma lens? And for this participant, it was really about building a tribe and really experiencing the world in a very different way and finding the people to help support that. So I appreciated that. And that comment just reminded me of that experience.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, it's there's so many. If psychedelics are soul revealing, then there's what an opportunity to better understand ourselves and our blind spots with things like race and also the community element is another opportunity space with mixed groups. A colleague of mine at Imperial, if I can still say I'm of Imperial, is doing fantastic work looking at the conflict in the Middle East between Palestinians and Israelis, and has published on mixed groups of Arabs and Jews drinking ayahuasca together in the Middle East, and is following up on that work now. That's Leo Roseman, and working with Matt on that. And this phenomenon of communitas as well, a sense of shared humanity, is something that is very relevant here. And yeah, there's something there. And so I'm mindful also, Chuck, of the that danger of psychedelics will save the world, kind of myth. But as Leo says, it's what you do. It's what you do with them. And I guess that's where our responsibility lies. There's some sort of just innocence in the revelation, but then there's some power in the plasticity, I suppose, that it be used responsibly. And this is where we find ourselves.
Well, it brings up another question. This is from Gabby Leanne Ages, who's a psychedelic therapy researcher at UCSF. And she would love to hear from all of you about comparing, the sterile research trials, which is what we need for, approval, legalization, to administering it with all of the rituals in traditional settings with shamanic or group elements. And Robin, you mentioned communitas factors, so you might want to describe what you've found so far in terms of intersubjective components.
We did find that experiences of communitas, and this is published, I think Hannes Kettner is the first author on this, was a major predictor of improvements in mental health, and specifically improvements in well-being, being mindful of the nature of this series. So it's a major vehicle towards positive mental health changes, this sense of shared experience. And those were data from psychedelic retreats, specifically, mostly mushroom retreats actually, or truffles, and a smaller proportion being ayahuasca. Yeah, so we can, from that, imagine that there's something in the ritual. I think ritual shaping and riding on top of the plasticity that the drug is doing on a biological level, and shaping the direction of things. And these trials, I'd be ashamed to call the setting that we've curated in our trials sterile. I suppose we come into clinical research settings and try and change that sterility and make it softer and warmer and more inviting. But I get the point. I suppose there's elements of perhaps heritage that are brought in, but then they're different, aren't they? You know, we don't have flower water puffing into the air or the guides singing Icaros, you know, so there's some important differences. Yeah.
Thank you. Fabulous answer. Sara or Chuck, did you want to comment on that?
Well, I mean, I'll just, you know, it's really interesting already what we are doing, where we have this sort of combination of psychotherapy with a pharmacologic agent. It's just pushing the boundaries of drug development. It's been such a lesson for me, realizing how rigid and how set our examination strategies have been for antidepressant modalities, pharmacologic antidepressant modalities. And the FDA, it's been this fascinating process to watch them evolve as they begin to think, well, shoot, we didn't think of that. Oh, was it therapy? Is it medicine? How do we approve therapy? How do we, you know, so that it's, you know, just down in these sort of trenches where the approval will or will not happen. Just, you know, as sterile as the approaches are compared to the far more elaborated ritual ways that these agents are used, you know, traditionally, it's really wild. And as I've said before, there are very, very powerful forces afoot interested in trying to strip away the remainder of all the things that Robin was talking about. So, you know, I mean, so there are definitely folks who are very interested in trying to get down to, you know, what is the least common denominator pharmacologic approach, clearing out as much of the remainder as possible. So you know, it's just amazing. But it also, I would say that, you know, if these agents can get through that narrow pass of this FDA process, the FDA trials are the doorway to the room. Once they're through the door, all sorts of amazing things will happen.
There's a lot of questions about, can I do this if I'm on antidepressants or if I have this health condition? And what about microdosing instead of high doses? And then, you know, and then lastly, there's a question of where do I go? So I'll just answer the where do I go really quickly. For legal treatment, clinicaltrials.gov. Chuck has pointed out that's pretty much the only place you can kind of search for and find trials on different psychedelic therapies. But any opinions on how we should think about microdosing versus high dose, you know, single or triple exposure?
Robin, you did the study.
Well, I would say people need to wait for some evidence to support it, because it's a bit thin. There's a lot of anecdote and media articles and hype around microdosing, but very little compelling evidence actually. The latest evidence, we did a study inviting people to do their own blinding procedure, placebos versus capsules containing a microdose, and found that if you got a placebo and you thought it was a microdose, you did as well as if you actually got a microdose. So the expectancy, the placebo effect, if you want to call it that, or the positive expectancy, was driving the majority of the positive outcome there with microdosing. So don't underestimate the power of the placebo effect, and maybe it's accounting for a lot with microdosing.
I also just want to mention, in addition to clinicaltrials.gov, that the FDA recently approved the expanded access program for MDMA therapy for PTSD. So for folks who are interested in learning more about that program, to follow MAPS and join their listserv, and they can stay up to date on what sites are going to be expanded access sites and all kinds of things related to that treatment.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful. Well, I think that is a great place to end. I have some wrap-up comments from our almost 2 years together. But I just wanted to say this is such a special time to hear from all three of you. And there's so much to learn, and you've taught us so much. It's been a very rich session. I just can't wait to, read these studies as they unfold. And I know, Sara, you're going to have a big influence on the field. A lot of people are talking about training, and, this is all going to be another big industry of people wanting to get into this field early on and do train to be therapists in this area. And, I think the mindfulness and meditation field is only just now trying to train more BIPOC practitioners. It's been such a, kind of siloed elitist field. And with that, I believe we are done. Thank you so much, Chuck, Robin, and Sara. It's been such a pleasure to learn from you.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Thank you.